Hello, everyone. My name is Greg. I am basically someone who does Pacific Island studies. What is Pacific Island studies? How many of you have been to a Pacific Island? Raise your hand. Okay, very few of you. And how many of you went there for any reason other than tourism? Okay, so it's pretty rare. I think it's sort of unusual to go to Pacific Islands from Japan or from other places here in this part of the world to the Pacific, unless you have, a resort booked or some kind of plan to go to the Pacific Islands for fun or for holidays. But for me, the Pacific Islands is a place which represents home. It also represents many contradictions. And it also represents important connections. So I want to talk today about connecting these different places together and how the Pacific Islands in particular, form something that is very special and that can teach us a lot about how to live in a world of globalization in the 21st century. Basically, when I talk about connecting, I'm really talking about all of these different ties between people. We have so many contradictions that polarize us and make us think about our world in rather negative ways. You might think about war, poverty, people who are haves and have-nots, people who, are essentially, they seem like they're violent, or we perpetuate militarism or colonialism. There are a lot of things that sort of clash in the world. And I'm not trying to present an idea that says that that is all something that we can wash away. But in some ways, by looking at the stories of the Pacific Islands and Pacific Islanders and how they have survived throughout the years, we can also learn a lot more about what they have to teach us. I'm talking about my own life, talking about the kinds of connections that I've made today. But basically, I also am very deeply indebted to all the people who've taught me. I'm going to talk about a few of them today. But essentially, I'm not a Pacific Islander. I'm not from the Pacific Islands, originally not indigenous, and I'm certainly not Japanese. But I live here in Japan and make this place my home, and the Pacific Islands has been my home. I began doing Pacific studies when I was about 1 year old, 2, 3 years old. This was because of my father's job. He was working as a consultant or a contractor for the United States military as a civilian on a place called Kwajalein Atoll. And there were lots of Americans living there. There's still many Americans living there, surrounded by the Marshall Islands and Marshallese people, indigenous people of the Marshall Islands. And so for me, it's a very personal sort of story, and I'll get into that in a moment. But I think most of us, especially here in Japan, when we think about the Pacific, we think about it as something that is very threatening, something that is deep, filled with violence in some ways. It's a place of fear. When you think about the tsunami that happened here in Japan a few years ago, we talk about devastation, talk about a great amount of loss. And then there's, from that perspective of kind of the fear that we have, or the placelessness that we assign to the Pacific, there's also the idea of paradise. You talk about paradise in Japan, and most people think about this. They think about a big, empty Pacific, which is rimmed, has all these different edges around it. Canada, the United States, Indonesia, Australia, and so forth. It has this rim around it that we call the Pacific Rim. And in the middle of that is paradise, Hawaii. This is the way many people in Japan think about the Pacific Islands, and I've learned this as I teach Pacific Island studies here in Japan. But of course, the Pacific is not only about Hawaii or Tahiti or any of those places. Hawaii is just one of many Pacific Islands. We could talk about the Pacific Islands more correctly as Oceania. Oceania, the very powerful and godfather-like figure of Pacific Island studies, Epeli Hau'ofa, gave us the term our sea of islands to talk about how these islands are all connected to each other and they're all related. Oceania. I like to use the term transoceanic to think about the crossings that we make between these different places. And when I think about this, it reminds me that although in the Pacific we have about 16 different member nations of the Pacific Islands Forum, there are thousands, tens of thousands, about 30,000 islands between the United States and Japan. And yet, most of us don't really think about that very deeply. I don't want to list all these islands, but there are, of course, independent sovereign nations, and there are also nations which are kind of not on the map. So there are many places that are not on the map. Many places, you look at these islands and you see the names of countries, you see the big names, but there are small places. There are even these tiny little islands that look small when you look at them from outer space, are big in comparison to a human being when you go to these places. They're big, they're someone's home, And this is not new. Pacific Islanders have been migrating to these islands and away from these islands, back and forth, for centuries and centuries and centuries, for thousands of years, back to probably 4,000 years, if not further back in time, coming in from what we contemporarily know as Taiwan into the Pacific from the east towards the west, some navigating from the south, navigating north using very sophisticated technologies. And so this idea of connection is something that is not very new, but it's something that we can learn a lot from here in Japan. For me, the Pacific is all about home. As I said, I grew up in the Marshall Islands, and then in the United States, and then in Japan. But I've made my own sort of connections, from the Marshalls to the States, to Japan, down to Australia. And I think we all make connections. And many of you gathered here today are very international citizens. You belong to more than one country. Your passport doesn't really matter as much as the kinds of memories that you have between places. That kind of non-nationalistic kind of memory is what I want to talk about a little bit more today. But Kwajalein Atoll, the place where I grew up, is a place that has seen some of the worst battles of history. One of the worst, most intense battles of World War II, the Pacific War, when over 8,000 people died, mostly Japanese, but also several Koreans, many Americans, and many Marshall Islanders, indigenous people of these islands. Kwajalein Atoll is about 70 miles across. It's a very, very large atoll. It's the biggest atoll in the world. And at the very bottom of that atoll, you see this little tiny looking island. But for me, that was home. That's where I lived. And I grew up looking at this very, very broad ocean and thinking about these various possibilities. For me, it was not strange to go around and play on World War II fortifications, like this Japanese bunker. This was me just playing around. It was my playground. I didn't realize that there were thousands and thousands of human remains that still had not been exhumed or returned to Japan, or that people even knew about on those islands. I didn't realize, for example, that zori was a word that was actually a Japanese word, because in the Marshall Islands, they still use that. In the Marshall Islands, people still use many Japanese words. They use even more in Palau, because in northern Oceania, in an area that we usually call Micronesia, Japan colonized those islands for 30 years. Those places were incorporated into Japan. They studied Japanese. Many elders still speak Japanese. It was curious to me that there was a big Japanese cemetery on the base where I grew up. And I would wonder, who were these Japanese people? Where did they come from? Why Japan? What's the story here? And so, as time went on, I became very curious, and that's what led me to come to Japan. Japan, after all, is not just a part of Asia, as we like to say. It's part of Oceania. Japan has over 6,500 islands. That's a lot. But these are also islands of memory. There are lots of deep memories, and there are lots of things that we can learn about those memories. My first teacher of Pacific Island Studies was a woman named Natari Pound. She was my boo-boo, my Marshallese grandmother. She took care of me and my brother when we were children. And she would tell me stories about her life as a child when she learned Japanese in school and she could speak a little bit of Japanese. She would sing Japanese songs to me. She would sing in Marshallese and in English as well. And for me, just like for her, I think all of those worlds kind of mixed together. I didn't think of myself as much as an American as I did someone who shared those histories with her. Unfortunately, she passed away about 2 years ago, but she was one of the first inspirations to help me to learn about these histories. Histories like this one, about a man named Ishiwata Katsunosuke who traveled to the island of Ebon in the 1930s to work as a young salaryman. Just like many people here will go on to get jobs in Japan, and work for a company, be sent someplace. People like Ishiwata went on to marry a Marshallese woman, have children, to establish a life there. And it's because of people like him that there are so many people who have Japanese descent in these islands. This doesn't apply to the whole Pacific, but in many ways we have these different kinds of connections between islands that are very, very important. I would look at my peaceful lagoon right outside my window every night when I was a little boy, and this is what I would see. I would see the radars from the missile testing and radar tracking facilities of our American installation, and I would feel a sense of calm, knowing that everyone was doing their job and everyone meant well, that they were doing the best that they could. My dad was working hard at his job. But I also knew that underneath these waves, underneath this calm sea, there were many, many Japanese ships that had been sunk during the war. These kinds of contradictions puzzled me. But I also accepted them, and I accepted them in the same way that probably many Marshall Islander children and children all over the Pacific accept these kinds of contradictions of globalization. Playing, for example, in the dugout holes that were made by bombs during World War II in a coral reef. Playing in that world, knowing about that world in some way, but also asking questions and remembering the kinds of things that sometimes we in so-called industrialized countries forget. And that leads me to my metaphor, a metaphor that I use very often. Coral. Coral is a living, breathing sort of organism. It's an animal, it's not a plant. Coral is like a memory organism. It travels on the ocean currents, it migrates around the world. And although, yes, it's bleaching and it's dying, and we're killing coral, as a metaphor, we can think about coral as this kind of deep time metaphor. Over these thousands of years, coral has built up the Pacific Islands. Little by little, these little tiny creatures have built these islands together. And what they're doing is they're effectively building these connections between places, swirling around, building their own sort of colonies. In English, we say coral colonies. And by this, what I mean to say is not to say that colonization or colonialism or nationalism, that any of these things are good, or that we should judge them in such utopian, magical, paradise-like terms, but to actually say that coral is something that lets us accept that these things all sit together. We can't filter out the good from the bad. That in fact, we are all involved in these histories. We cooperate in these histories. We have responsibilities. We have responsibilities to these islands and to this ocean. And when we talk about things like global warming, and we talk about sustainability, that's one thing. When we talk about overseas development assistance, that's another thing. But we tend to divide the world into these contradictory first world, third world kind of divisions. And I don't think that's fair. I think we can learn from each other. And I think there are new paradigms that we need to learn about cooperation and realizing that we each have different kinds of knowledge that needs to be valued and needs to be shared with each other. So when we look at the Pacific and we look at the Pacific Islands, I hope that we begin to see beyond the touristic beaches and the hotels and the kind of fantasies that we have, or the stories about the war, that we remember those things. We value them. But at the same time, we go on to imagine how, just like coral, our stories are affecting each other, and we are connected to each other in different ways. The coral reefs of the Marshall Islands, in the Sea of Islands, go on to create the coral reefs as they flow along the Kuroshio Current of the Federated States of Micronesia. And they give birth to the reefs of the Northern Mariana Islands and Palau. And those reefs are also actually creating Ogasawara, and they're coming on and creating parts of Japan. You see, we're co-creating each other, just like the coral. Our stories affect each other. We are deeply, deeply connected, and in our very globalized world, we're even connected more. I believe in reconnecting. I believe in finding new paradigms for connecting. Not just going and volunteering and trying to help people that seem like they're less fortunate than us. No. Why don't we try to find ways of partnership, partnering with each other? Why are creative individuals who work in marketing firms, advertising firms, film producers and so forth, why are they not going to Pacific Islands and trying to tell the stories of Pacific Islanders? Why don't we try to have a more interesting conversation with each other? So I began to think about reconnecting people, trying to bring unlikely people together. And I came up with the idea of trying to get the bereaved families of the Japanese who died in the Battle of Kwajalein, where I grew up, together with some of the Marshall Islanders who had also experienced that battle, and get them to talk with the Americans who work on that military base today. What would they say to each other? What kinds of stories would they share? And they did, and they enjoyed it. They sang songs, they laughed together. And they realized that in the wake of war, and in all of these memories, there was a lot of happiness to be had. That it wasn't all about sadness and guilt and shame, but there was a lot to celebrate. That there was a lot of connection that could be celebrated and enjoyed, and that could be brought forth into the future. So it was that inspired me to start something which I call Project Sango. Project Sango, in Japanese, it's san and go. And I don't have any special meaning for the 35, except for the fact that I started it when I was 35. But Sango in Japanese means coral. So Project Sango is all about this idea of linking people together through unlikely ways. And I'm trying to work with some of the cutting-edge leading artists from throughout the Pacific. For example, people like Yuki Kihara. There are others like Michael Tuffrey, other people that I plan to speak to throughout the coming years. Bring them to Japan. Bring artists from Micronesia and other parts of the Pacific who remember the war, who have those kinds of stories. Bring them to Japan. And for artists from all over Japan and all of these other archipelagos all around Japan to begin to go back to the Pacific or out to the Pacific for the first time and start to engage with artists there, to develop a new kind of language, a new way of thinking about things, to develop new ways of cooperating with each other and finding these connections. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about my story, but hopefully this inspires your stories as well as you think about the kinds of connections that you make. And realize in so many ways how we are actually really indebted to this ocean that connects us all. It's not empty space, it's a connection. It's something that brings us all together. Thank you very much.